Ever planted sweet potatoes only to dig them up at the end of the season and find a handful of skinny little roots that barely fill a single basket? You put in all that time, all that space in your garden, and the harvest just doesn't match the effort. Well, in this video, I'm going to walk you through the complete process of growing sweet potatoes from start to finish, covering everything from getting your slips to harvesting and curing for the best flavor. Plus, stick around to the end where I'll show you how to grow your own slips for next year so you never have to buy them again. Let's get started. Sweet potatoes are one of the most rewarding crops you can grow in a home garden. They're nutritious, they store for months, and once you get the hang of growing them, they'll produce huge harvests year after year. The good news is they're actually much easier than most people think. Once you understand how they grow and give them what they need, you'll be pulling beautiful, sweet potatoes out of the ground by the bucketful. So let's start by understanding exactly how this plant works. One of the most important things to know when you're growing sweet potatoes is that we're not planting seeds or even planting the sweet potato itself. We're planting what's called a slip, which is a sprout that grows off of a mature sweet potato. Now here's where it gets interesting. Unlike regular potatoes where you're planting a piece of the tuber, with sweet potatoes you're planting a rooted cutting. That slip will root into the soil, send out vines above ground, and those vines will produce what are called adventitious roots underground. Those adventitious roots are what swell up and become your sweet potatoes. So really, the more vine growth you get, the more potential you have for sweet potato production down below. That's why giving your plants a long growing season and keeping those vines healthy is so critical. The sweet potatoes need about 90 to 120 days of warm weather to produce a good harvest, and some varieties need even longer. That's important to keep in mind when we talk about timing. Now that we understand how sweet potatoes actually grow, let's talk about getting your hands on those slips. When it comes to getting slips for planting, you've got two main options. You can buy them from a nursery or garden center, or you can grow your own from a sweet potato you already have. If you're buying slips, I recommend ordering from a reputable online supplier or picking them up at your local garden center in spring. You'll typically find them available from late April through June, depending on where you live. When you're selecting slips, look for ones that are about 6 to 12 inches long with healthy green leaves and visible roots at the bottom. Avoid any that look wilted, yellowed, or have any signs of disease. Now here's a pro tip. If you order slips online and they arrive looking a little sad and wilted from shipping, don't panic. Just put the root ends in a jar of water and set them in a bright spot for a day or two. They'll perk right back up and be ready to plant. I've done this many times and they recover beautifully. Now if you want to grow your own slips, it's actually a really satisfying process. You'll need to start about 8 to 10 weeks before your last frost date. Take a healthy organic sweet potato and suspend it in a jar of water using toothpicks so that the bottom third is submerged. Place it in a warm spot with bright indirect light. Within a few weeks, you'll start to see sprouts emerging from the eyes of the potato. Once those sprouts are about 6 inches long and have developed their own roots, you can gently twist them off the mother potato. Those are your slips, ready to plant. One sweet potato can produce anywhere from 8 to 15 slips, sometimes more. So if you're planning a big planting, just start with 2 or 3 potatoes and you'll have plenty. I personally prefer growing my own slips because I know exactly where they came from and I can choose varieties that have done well in my garden before. But buying slips is perfectly fine too, especially if you're trying a new variety or you're short on time. Either way, once you've got your slips, it's time to prepare your planting area. Sweet potatoes are not picky plants, but they do have some strong preferences when it comes to soil and location. First, let's talk about sunlight. These plants want full sun, and I mean full sun. We're talking at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight per day, and honestly, the more the better. Sweet potatoes are tropical plants that love heat and light, so give them the sunniest spot you've got. For soil, Sweet potatoes prefer loose, well-draining soil that's on the sandy side. Heavy clay soil is their enemy because it restricts root development and holds too much moisture, which can lead to rot. If you've got clay soil like a lot of folks do, don't worry. You can still grow great sweet potatoes by building raised beds or mounding up your rows. Speaking of mounding, this is one of the best things you can do for your sweet potato harvest. I recommend creating raised rows, or mounds about 8 to 12 inches high and about 12 to 18 inches wide at the base. These mounds warm up faster in spring, provide excellent drainage, and give those tubers plenty of loose soil to expand into. In my garden, I've found that planting in mounded rows versus flat ground makes a noticeable difference in both the size and quantity of sweet potatoes I harvest. Before planting, you'll want to work in some compost or well-rotted organic matter to give the soil good structure and fertility. But here's something important. Go easy on the nitrogen. Too much nitrogen will give you beautiful lush vines and disappointing little tubers. Sweet potatoes actually do better in soil that's moderately fertile. If you've been heavily amending a bed for years, it might actually be too rich for sweet potatoes. I like to use beds where I grew heavy feeders like tomatoes or corn the year before. Those crops used up a lot of the nitrogen, leaving the soil in just the right condition for sweet potatoes. As for soil pH, sweet potatoes prefer slightly acidic to neutral soil, somewhere in the range of 5.8 to 6.5. But honestly, they're pretty forgiving on pH. If your soil grows decent vegetables, it'll probably grow decent sweet potatoes. Once your mounds are built and your soil is ready, it's time to get those slips in the ground. Timing is everything with sweet potatoes. These are warm weather crops that absolutely hate cold soil. You want to wait until at least 2 to 3 weeks after your last frost date to plant, and the soil temperature should be at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Ideally 65 or warmer. In most parts of the country, that means planting anywhere from mid-May to early June. If you're in zones 8 through 11, you can plant earlier. If you're up in zones 5 or 6, you might be waiting until late May or even June. Don't rush it. Planting in cold soil will set your plants back significantly and can even kill the slips outright. When you're ready to plant, space your slips about 12 to 18 inches apart within the row. And if you're doing multiple rows, keep them about 3 to 4 feet apart to give those vines room to sprawl. Now here's how to actually plant the slip. You want to bury about half of the slip, leaving the top leaves exposed above the soil. Make a hole or trench about 4 to 6 inches deep. Lay the slip in at a slight angle and cover the buried portion firmly with soil. Make sure at least 2 or 3 leaf nodes are buried because that's where the roots and eventually the tubers will form. I like to plant my slips in the late afternoon or on a cloudy day to reduce transplant shock. The first few days after planting are critical. Water your slips in right after planting and keep the soil consistently moist for the first week to 10 days while they establish roots. You don't want soggy soil, but you don't want it drying out either. Once you see new growth starting to emerge from the top of the slip, you'll know the roots have taken hold and you can back off the watering a bit. By the way, if you're finding this helpful, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future videos. All right, let's keep going. Once your sweet potato slips are established and starting to vine out, the care routine is actually pretty straightforward. Let's break down exactly what these plants need to thrive. Watering is important, especially during the first month while the plants are establishing. After that initial period, sweet potatoes are actually fairly drought tolerant. I water mine deeply about once a week during dry spells, giving them about 1 to 2 inches of water. The key is to water deeply and less frequently, rather than shallow and often. This encourages the roots to grow down deep into those mounds you created. One thing to watch out for is inconsistent watering late in the season. If you let the soil get bone dry and then hit it with a lot of water, you can get cracking in your tubers. So try to keep things relatively even, especially in the last month before harvest. For fertilizing, remember what I said earlier about nitrogen. You don't want to overdo it. I typically give my sweet potatoes one-side dressing of a balanced or slightly lower nitrogen fertilizer about 4 to 6 weeks after planting. Something like a 5-10-10 or similar works well. Work it into the soil a few inches away from the base of the plants and water it in. After that, I usually leave them alone. Too much fertilizer, especially nitrogen, pushes all that energy into vine growth instead of tuber development. You'll end up with a jungle of beautiful vines and a disappointing harvest underground. Now let's talk about those vines. Sweet potato vines will spread and sprawl everywhere, which is actually a good thing. That foliage is capturing sunlight and producing the energy that gets stored in the tubers. Some folks like to lift and redirect the vines occasionally to keep them from rooting at the nodes as they spread across the ground. The theory is that if the vines root along their length, energy gets diverted to those new roots instead of the main tubers back at the base of the plant. Honestly, I've tried it both ways and haven't noticed a dramatic difference. But if you want to maximize your harvest, gently lifting and repositioning the vines every few weeks doesn't hurt. Just be careful not to damage them. Weeding is really only critical in the first month or so. Once those vines start spreading, they'll shade out most weeds on their own. But early on, keep the area around your plants clean so they don't have competition. Mulching around your plants can help with this and also keep soil moisture more consistent. I use straw mulch between my mounded rows, but I keep it off the mounds themselves because I want those mounds to absorb as much heat as possible. Sweet potatoes love warm soil, so anything that keeps that soil temperature up is beneficial. Let's talk about some common problems you might run into and how to solve them. Honestly, sweet potatoes are one of the more trouble-free crops you can grow, but there are a few things to watch for. First, if you're seeing holes in your leaves and the edges look chewed, you're probably dealing with sweet potato flea beetles or other leaf-eating insects. The damage usually looks worse than it is. A healthy sweet potato plant can handle quite a bit of leaf damage without affecting the harvest. If the infestation is severe, you can use an organic insecticide like spinosad or neem oil, but in most cases I just leave them alone and the plants grow right through it. Second, if your vines are wilting even though the soil is moist, you might be dealing with a fungal issue or root rot. This is often caused by poor drainage or planting in soil that stays too wet. Unfortunately, there's not much you can do once root rot sets in. The best approach is prevention. Make sure your soil drains well, and those mounds are tall enough to keep water from pooling around the roots. Third, if you dig up your sweet potatoes and find tunnels or damage on the tubers themselves, you're probably dealing with wireworms or sweet potato weevils. Wireworms are the larvae of click beetles, and they love to burrow into root crops. Crop rotation helps a lot here. Don't plant sweet potatoes in the same spot year after year. Sweet potato weevils are a more serious pest, especially in southern states. The adults are small beetles that lay eggs on the stems near the soil line, and the larvae burrow into the tubers. If you've had weevil problems, make sure to remove and destroy all plant debris after harvest and don't save any tubers from infested plants for slips next year. Fourth, cracking in your tubers is usually caused by inconsistent watering, especially heavy rain or irrigation after a dry spell late in the season. The tubers grow rapidly and the skin can't keep up, causing splits. Keep your watering as consistent as possible in the weeks leading up to harvest. Fifth, if your plants look healthy all season but you end up with small tubers at harvest, it usually means one of a few things. Either the growing season wasn't long enough, the soil was too heavy and compacted, or you over-fertilized with nitrogen. In my experience, the most common cause is simply not giving them enough time. Sweet potatoes need that full 90 to 120 days of warm weather to size up properly. If you're in a shorter season area, choose an earlier maturing variety like Beauregard or Georgia Jet. The good news is, if you follow the steps we've covered so far, You should be able to avoid most of these issues and end up with a beautiful harvest. Now let's talk about the best part. Harvesting your sweet potatoes. You'll want to start thinking about harvest when the vines begin to yellow and die back, usually in late summer or early fall. In most areas, that's around September or October. You can also harvest earlier if frost is threatening, since sweet potatoes do not tolerate frost at all. A light frost will kill the vines, and if the cold gets down into the soil, it can damage the tubers themselves. So keep an eye on your weather forecast and plan to harvest before any hard frost arrives. To harvest, use a digging fork rather than a shovel. Start about 12 to 18 inches away from the base of the plant and work your way in carefully. Sweet potato tubers can grow surprisingly far from the main plant, and they bruise easily. Go slow and be gentle. Once you've loosened the soil, you can reach in with your hands and pull the tubers out. Shake off the excess dirt, but don't wash them yet. Any moisture on the skin at this stage can lead to rot during storage. Now here's something a lot of people skip, but it makes a huge difference. Curing. Freshly dug sweet potatoes don't taste nearly as good as cured ones. The curing process converts starches to sugars and heals any small cuts or scrapes on the skin, which helps them store longer. To cure your sweet potatoes, place them in a warm, humid location for about 10 to 14 days. You want temperatures around 80 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit with high humidity, around 80 to 90% if possible. A covered porch, a warm garage, or even a bathroom with a space heater can work. After curing, move them to a cool, dark place around 55 to 60 degrees for long-term storage. Properly cured sweet potatoes will keep for 6 months or more. Trust me, that first baked sweet potato in January from your summer harvest is something special. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. Let me show you how to grow your own slips for next year so you never have to buy them again. When you're harvesting, set aside a few of your best-looking medium-sized sweet potatoes. You want ones that are healthy, free of damage, and representative of the variety you want to grow. Store these separately from your eating potatoes in a cool, dark place over the winter. Then in late winter, about 8 to 10 weeks before your last frost date, bring them out and start the slip growing process I described earlier. Suspend each potato in a jar of water with the bottom third submerged. Place them in a warm spot with bright light and wait for the magic to happen. Within 3 to 4 weeks, you'll see sprouts emerging, and within 6 to 8 weeks, you'll have slips ready to plant. One medium sweet potato can easily produce a dozen slips, so just 3 or 4 potatoes can supply enough slips for a sizable planting. I've been doing this for years now, and it's incredibly satisfying to know that my sweet potato patch is completely self-sustaining. The varieties I grow have been selected over time from my best performers, and each year the harvest seems to get a little better. So that's everything you need to know about growing sweet potatoes for a huge harvest. If you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. And if you have any questions or tips of your own, drop them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and good luck in the garden.